COVID lockdowns forced us all into exile from our churches and temples. Now we've returned only to find things aren't the same. If we're really honest, we still haven't recovered. In our case, the temple is the people, the ecclesia, and our temple is in tatters, lowered attendance, different faces every week, and we've lost our ability to community. But there's hope. Join us now as J. Oliver Glasgow and his guests explore a generation from 2 millennia ago that faced the same exact problem, being exiled in Babylon and returning only to find their temple in tatters, losing their ability to community. What can we learn? How can 6 books of the Hebrew Bible that chronicles the Lord's guidance and their choices transform our tattered temples today to better than they were before? This is Exile's Return.
As we start our journey together in the book of Ezra, the scriptural year is 539 BC, and the children of God have just been released from their exile that had separated them from their temple. In our timeline, we too have spent time in exile, separated from our temple, and have recently returned. Both generations, then and now, share many things in common. What will we learn from them that will help us rebuild today? Welcome in to Exile's Return. I'm your host, J. Oliver Glasgow, and in studio with us for our introductory episode is biblical and military scholar and advisor and retired federale, just kidding, Jay Garza. Jay, the first time we have a guest on, we want the audience to get to know you a little better. So I like using a technique that was employed by the French philosopher and interviewer Bernard Pivot. I'm probably murdering the last name. He used to ask a set of 10 questions, and we're on a tight budget, so I can only ask 4.5. So, first, Star Trek or Star Wars?
Star Trek.
Who is your favorite sports team?
That's a difficult one because I'm more into MMA, but if I had to pick a sports team, I'd say San Diego Chargers.
What profession, other than yours, would you most want to attempt?
I love teaching in the profession that I do, but I've often wondered what it would be like to teach professionally, like in a school or in a college.
What is your favorite flavor?
Vanilla.
And this is the half a question. We ran out of money halfway through. So who would you like to? And that's where we ran out of money.
Oh, I see. So, yeah, that's a good spot to end out of money.
So who would you like to?
Spock.
Got it. Jay Garza, Army vet, strategy and intelligence, urban warfare specialist, resilience, use of force expert, martial arts, leadership, and warrior mindset coach for hire, much more. And in many ways, a survivor.
I think that when you go through life traumas yourself, right? I mean, like you can coach about something, you can talk about something, but unless you walk that walk, you really have no idea what it's like. You're teaching the concepts, right? So yes, when, we've been through some life traumas in my family, and so I think that has given me a completely different way of looking at resilience and teaching resilience, right? And what are the concepts that help people actually overcome when they run across those life challenges?
COVID exile. Was it a real thing, or are we making much ado about nothing?
It's interesting when you first called me about this. I really hadn't looked at it from that perspective or in that context. And since I've actually been going back and forth between, the exile of the people of Israel and then the COVID exile. And there are some similarities, right? Sort of a complete change of life, complete change of lifestyle, complete new way of doing things that's different than what you were used to. The lack of social contact, interaction, person to person, and just the trauma of not knowing what tomorrow's going to bring. Sort of this idea of living in fear, right? You couldn't help but turn on the TV every now and then, and you hear the numbers and the number of losses. And even within our own families, everyone was affected. I know that I saw my son go through it in the early portion of battling that disease, and watching him go through it was horrific, and it was scary, and it tests your resolve, and it tests your faith and everything else. So, I think there's a lot of similarities that we can draw there.
A typical way to audit the mental health of a society is to look at the numbers of voluntary screenings that people take. There are screenings that we could consider lead measurements, harbingers that measure things that, as they occur, like depression, anxiety, bipolar, psychoses. Then there are lag measurements like eating disorders, youth-parent problems, alcoholism, substance abuse, and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not surprising that the Mental Health America, or MHA, reported recently that the lead measurements went way up during COVID. We were, scared?
Well, I think anytime you're in a fear-based mindset, which is one of the things that we love teaching about, right? So what's the mindset? And if the mindset is fear-based, there's a lot of consequences that go along with that, right? You're projecting towards a horrible future. You're afraid of what might happen. And so you're living actually day to day in a fear-based state. And that, of course, brings on, how do I cope with that? Right?
That's right. Is adrenaline part of that?
Well, of course. Anytime your mind goes into a fear-based state, you're going to get a rush of adrenaline, right? And this is something that we teach our law enforcement, federal officers, and across the board first responders, is that anytime you're responding to something, you're going to get a shot of adrenaline, right? And so how do you control that? Okay? That's really critical to use of force and to first responders, you going to a scene. But it goes beyond that. There's how you respond in the moment, and there's also how you respond to it long term. So I'll give you an example. One of the hardest things to teach officers is to learn how to control that spike of adrenaline. You get a rush, and there's some things that come along with it. So, for example, and it's just natural, your body's natural response to that shot of adrenaline. So you get tunnel vision, your vision narrows because it's going to just focus on what the threat is, right? You get auditory exclusion, which again, your auditory scope narrows to just what's in front of you, what's the threat. So you get situations where your partner may be yelling at you, right? And you don't hear anything they're saying because your whole focus is, where's the threat, right? So tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, loss of fine motor movement, right? Because all the blood's pumping. Adrenaline gets your heartbeat going, gets your heart pumping because you're going to need that oxygen, right? Stops doing menial things that it doesn't need. And so there's all of this action going on inside your body. And how do you control that? I mean, that's a difficult thing. And the only way we found to be successful in that is to keep putting officers in scenarios that mimic that, right? And build on their stress response and their ability to cope with high levels of stress, making split-second decisions, right, over and over again. So they have a sense of what it's like, and they have a sense of what their limit is within that environment. But that's just the initial response, right? One of the things we don't talk about is, what are the long-term response to this, right? Because you get this high, and then you get the lows that come afterwards. But in the interim, you may have been exposed to trauma. And that doesn't just go away at the end of the day.
No.
Right?
And when left, if you're untrained on even to how to handle that, right, the threshold could be even lower than a professionally trained.
No, absolutely. And so when we talk about trauma and trauma exposure, you have a couple of things to look at. Number one, is it direct trauma that directly affect you? Well, if I'm a first responder or an officer to the scene, yeah, it's directly impacting me at that moment. But then I walk away, right? I do whatever I have to do, the actions take place, and then I seem to walk away. And we sort of expect that, okay, well, we're done with that. But we're not. Our mind is still processing, right? And whether the trauma was direct or what we call vicarious trauma, simply by observing, right? Like for first responders, it's difficult to, day after day, see scenes or be exposed to scenes that are just heart-wrenching. You know, whether it's a child dead in a vehicle accident, someone who's a fire victim, or someone who just died in the hospital bed and you've been treating them for a while and now their whole family's there. You're suffering from that vicarious trauma. And it's now a part of you. So how do you deal with it? That becomes the question, right?
That initial hit is volatile, and our emotions are volatile. They're very short-lived. But then if left untreated, it moves into what scientists, medical experts call vitriolic, which is a little longer lasting. Would it surprise you to hear that the MHA reported that the numbers of self-reported screenings flipped a year later, and the lead numbers went down and the lag numbers went up? The mental issues that are more vitriolic, eating disorders, youth parent problems, alcoholism, substance abuse, and PTSD, came way up.
Sure. No, it's not surprising at all. As people try to cope with the changes and with the trauma, oftentimes we look for coping mechanisms that are unhealthy, right? And so we find in law enforcement, for example, the stats for divorces are, off the charts, right?
Wow.
And so alcoholism is also a problem, right? Because it's sort of the way we hang around. We do what's called choir practice, where we all get around and kind of talk about the things that we've experienced, right? And as we're sharing that, we're sharing some alcoholic beverages. And so a one-time thing might be okay, but if that becomes your go-to for handling the stress, the traumas, the vicarious things that you might have been exposed to, you can see where that becomes a problem.
Right. The Bible sometimes feels antiquated for many readers, and at other times remarkably fresh. In some disciplines, tactical is the immediate application of a tool or technique to a problem, and strategic is a long-term approach. Should we use the Bible tactically or strategically here?
That's an interesting question, Jay. I think that when you talk to military experts, they say that warriors talk about tactics, but leaders talk about strategy. Okay, because you got to have a strategic approach, a long-term approach. It's not just about the battle today, it's how am I going to win this battle long-term, right? How am I going to win the war, not just this battle? So yes, taking a strategic approach becomes critical. And so then what are the strategies is the next question, right?
Yes. When authors such as myself and pastors or rabbis or teachers such as you develop content with which we hope will be wildly engaging, should we make it challenging to answer that question of, is it strategic? Is it tactical? Should we make it difficult or a challenge for the student? Or should we make it undemanding?
So I'll share with you from firsthand experience. I think you need to make it honest and just pull the Band-Aid off and address it. Right? Now, I'll give you an example. So I've been going around the country, me and my wife, for the last 5 years, talking about trauma, talking about a hard issue like suicide, right? And so we unfortunately lost our daughter about 7 years ago. And she was battling anxiety and depression. And unfortunately, it was one of the type of anxiety and depressions where she was able to hide it, right? She was a high performer, and so you really couldn't see it, okay? And so the day that we suffered her loss, it came as a total shock to us. It was completely unexpected. We knew that she was dealing with anxiety, but we didn't know to what level, we didn't know to what degree, or the connection between anxiety and depression. And so, yeah, we sent her to counseling, we were trying to help her along the way, but that event completely changed our lives, obviously, right? And so what we found as we went around talking to first responders within my agency at the time in Homeland Security, sharing her story and then sharing how you can best try to build resilience in others and overcome situations like that. I think what I found is, at least within the first responder community, we all carry a shield, right? Like an emotional shield, very much like we carry, the ballistic shield. We have this facade about who we are, who we need to project to be to handle the difficult things that happen in our jobs every day.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very rare to see someone put their shield down, right? But this is the interesting piece, and this is what I discovered that made what we were trying to teach much more effective. I had to get myself to the point where I put my shield down in front of them. I took the Band-Aid off. I put the facade of, I'm a tough law enforcement guy, military background, right? And I put it down and simply shared with them, listen, when this hit me, it completely tore me apart, right? I learned how to cry. I learned how to say I'm broken, right? I learned how to just lay there on the ground and just cry. And you know what? It's okay. It doesn't make me any less an officer, an agent. Doesn't make me any less a man. And so by standing up there in front of them and sharing that with them just straightforward, as difficult as it might be, what we found was people allowed themselves to open up, right? They saw me sharing just from a very honest place, very raw, very emotional. And yet by doing that, they were able to put their shields down and start sharing their challenges, their traumas, things that they were dealing with. And before long, it was an interesting thing to watch because it's a group discussion, or it's a presentation, but there's back and forth. And before long, different people are sharing their traumas.
So the Bible puts its shield down if we pay attention, right? But if we're picking verses, and I see a lot of people studying the Bible, they'll say, hey, I'm going to take this verse over here, I'm going to jump back over here and read this thing. Even if we read the books in the order that they're printed, they're out of order, right? So you just told this amazingly intense story that when the listeners listen, they have to go from the very beginning to the very end in context, right? If somebody had just tuned in or listened to a snippet here and a snippet there, they wouldn't have gotten the impact. And it wouldn't have put the shield down, would it?
No.
You have to understand the entire thing in order for you to even understand the concept. I found the Bible also is pretty raw. It doesn't really paint a pretty picture over things.
Correct.
It's pretty real in the pain people are facing. We're going to see that in some of the things we talk about in the coming podcasts. For this study that our listeners are about to engage in, we've taken a little time to lay out 6 books of the Hebrew Bible in order that tell the story of the children of God returning from exile, only to find their temple in ruins. In the coming weeks, we'll be joined by guests like Jay Garza and think through a chapter at a time what they faced back then and see if it aligns with what we face today. And where they turned to God, we should turn to God. It worked for them. They restored their temple to better than it was before. Jay, will it work for us?
Well, I really like that you bring up the issue of, or the challenge of context, right? When we study scripture. Now, me and you met in that environment where I was teaching or attempting to teach a Sabbath school or equivalent of a Sunday school class. And one of the reasons we drummed up our friendship was I think we have the same approach in terms of how we study, right? I think with my background sort of in law enforcement and in intelligence in the military is to question everything, right? Because I want context. Because context really tells me everything about what I'm reading, whatever the source document might be. And without that context, I can very easily misconstrue whatever that source document is. So to that point, I've always enjoyed the way within our friendship that we're always talking about what's the context of this, right? Where is it coming from? Now, when we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, it's really important to have that context, right? So a couple of just key things off the bat. It's one book. You know, in our Bibles, it's divided into two, but it's one author trying to share one theme, one story, right? And it's broken up into several pieces, literally, right? The literary form is broken up into several pieces, but it's one author trying to tell one story, right? But it's not just obviously apparent as you read through it what the objective is, okay? And so the background, when you talk about scripture, I think it's really important. And I think this is a great analogy. Scripture, if you can imagine, you're reading something and then there's a hyperlink, right? Well, you get to a reference and it says something about, for example, in our case, talking about Ezra and Nehemiah, there might be a reference to Jeremiah. Right? And we go, why was that there? Well, the author is expecting that you go into that hyperlink and that you read or you're familiar with Jeremiah. So then everything he's writing then comes into context for you, right? The other thing we need to realize about Ezra and Nehemiah is that it's not chronological, right? In our culture, we're used to everything being chronological. It starts here. At this time, this happened, right? Like even in my profession, you got to be chronological and factual, and it's got to meet a certain criteria. Ezra and Nehemiah is not written that way. It's written thematically, right? He's trying to draw a theme here over and over. Kind of you see the same thing reappear. And so in reading Ezra and Nehemiah, if you're trying to follow the chronology, you're going to run into some problems, right? Because it's not written chronologically, right? So it's important not to get wrapped around the axle on that, right? As the author might sometimes jump 60 years forward or go into the past, and you're left wondering, what is going on?
You and I are going to have this debate in 4 weeks on chapter 4.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to that.
No, absolutely. But in terms of just setting the context, I think it's really important, right? That people understand the author is assuming that you understand Jeremiah and the prophecies that were made in Jeremiah, right? And at the heart of it, what was Jeremiah's message? Because if you don't have that in mind, then you might miss what they're trying to get to as they're trying to rebuild.
Yes, so we encourage all of the people that are participating in Exile's Return to go read Jeremiah. Definitely take those hyperlinks and go back and check them out. All right, Jay Garza, thank you. It was an honor having you on today. And to you listening, thank you for joining us. God's mercy and direction are just a prayer away. Shalom.
You can read along each week with the materials you'll find at shalomdfw.care/exile. Join us next time as J. Oliver Glasgow and his guests think through our next chapter in Exile's Return. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast, and join the online conversation at shalomdfw.care. I'm Kurt Booten. Thanks for listening.